All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, An Introduction to California Research. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Meaghan Siekman, genealogist of the Newbury Street Press. Meaghan holds a PhD in history from Arizona State University, where her focus was public history and American Indian history. Prior to joining American Ancestors, she worked as curator of the Fairbanks House Museum in Dedham, Massachusetts, and as an archivist at the Head Museum Library in Phoenix. Meaghan's areas of interest include American Indian history and lineage, African American research, colonial New England, New York, and German genealogy, as well as immigration to America, westward migration and settlement, and tracing maternal lines. So California has a rich history that reflects the state's diverse cultural heritage and dynamic social changes. From Native American tribes who first inhabited the land to Spanish missionaries to gold rush pioneers and immigrants from around the world, each group has left an indelible mark on California's identity. Meaghan will provide an introduction to doing family history research in the state, starting with the period of pre-contact to statehood and beyond. We will also discuss go-to record collections, published resources, and online and on-site research repositories. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many of those as we can at the end. There is also an optional syllabus available for purchase that accompanies today's webinar. Your purchase helps support us in providing this and other free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Meaghan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to talk to you about California and getting started in researching your ancestors there, or even just getting to know the state a little bit better and the state history. So, where you want to start when you're doing research in any part of the world, really, is getting to know the history of that region. So, I've kind of designed this lecture today to it moves somewhat chronologically through the different eras of California history. So, we'll start first by talking about indigenous nations that called what became California home before European contact. We'll also talk about the contact zones with Spain and its period as Mexico or Mexican California. We'll talk about statehood, and in that, the gold rush and mining, of course, is a big topic that people are interested in. And then also the growth of cities. And we'll talk a little bit about recreation tourism more recently, and of course, immigration and different ethnic groups that have touched California's history across all of those periods. So I wanted to talk about the or lay out the ethnic groups that we'll be talking about. So California has always been a diverse region, even before European contact. So there are several indigenous groups that call California home. And we'll also be talking, you could see this is kind of the racial makeup of California in 2018 by the US Census Bureau. And you can see that it's still a very diverse place. And there are different ethnic groups that have come in large waves through immigration to California that have all kind of created record sets that we will talk about, or the reaction to those people coming into California has created record sets that we will talk about. So some of the groups we're going to talk about today are the indigenous populations, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, African Americans, and of course, just kind of broader European influence, particularly with the gold rush, where you have people coming from all different European nations trying to get a piece of the gold that was found in California. So, in starting from the beginning, humans arrived in the region that would become California about 13,000 years ago or so. And the cultural diversity has always been dense in the region. So, this is a great map that was put together by the state of California Native American Heritage Commission. They have a digital atlas of California Native Americans, and they have different maps that you can lay on top of each other to get an idea of the cultural regions of the state. So this is the estimated population by region before colonization. Gives you an idea of the cultural groups and the language groups that existed throughout California before European contact, or right at the point of European contact. And moving through some of the other things that you can do with these maps, they have some neat tools, such as these trade relationships that existed before colonization, that can give you an idea of how people were interacting across the state prior to colonization. And then also, I've laid that on top of another map where you can lay out where all the Spanish missions were established along pretty much the coast of the state. And you can also see how this could be helpful if you're interested in researching an ancestor that was part of an indigenous group. You can see how even if you were not directly next to a mission, that the relationships that existed across the state already may have included your ancestors in those mission records. So these types of tools can be helpful to kind of see how relationships are interacting across the state. And then, of course, just kind of fast forwarding a little bit to American statehood, they also have maps that you can then see what lands were then claimed by the US once it became a state. And then also treaty lands and reservations that were negotiated between tribes and the federal government. And this, you can see that the yellow part here is the land that was claimed by the US. The green is then land that was promised to tribes as reservations. And then there's kind of like that bluish green that are actual reservations and allotments. And this site, if you go onto this website and you play with these maps, they do have a disclaimer there that this is not the end all be all of this type of information. There's more information that you can gather from the groups themselves. But this is kind of a group coming together trying to piece out some of these historic relationships and the cultures across the state. So it's a good starting point if you are if you're thinking that you have indigenous roots in California, to kind of get an idea of the different cultural groups and where they were located within the state, and then what kind of relationship they would have had with Spanish missions when Spain is coming into the area. And the reason why that's important is because the Spanish records are the records that you would then be looking at to try to get written documentation of those ancestors. So these types of maps can be helpful just in kind of gauging where you might look for information. And what I always say to folks if they are thinking that they have indigenous ancestry is that you should definitely talk to and reach out to the nation that you're researching or that you think that you are a part of or descended from. Most nations now have websites like this one. This is for the Round Valley Indian tribes in California. And they do have then contact information. The next slide, you can see at the top, you could click on contact. And then you have contact information. You can either write to the tribe or you can call them and get some more information about what kind of records they may hold, what information they have about their history, and how you might find out more information about your connections to those groups. So it's important not to just do the work on your own, but to also reach out to the communities that you're trying to connect to or work with. So as far as European influence, there's sporadic Spanish expeditions in the 16th and 17th century. And so that means that Spain is in California. There's contact in California in those centuries. And the effects of those are felt by the indigenous populations that are living in California at the time because, not only through trade and things like that, but disease is brought into California, and that has a disastrous effect on a number of the indigenous populations in the area that had no immunity to some of the diseases that the Europeans were bringing into California. But by sporadic Spanish expeditions, that means that we're not talking about missions or settlements yet in this period. So in the area that would become what California is right now, the Spain is kind of south of that into present day Mexico, establishing their settlements there. They hadn't really moved up into California yet as far as settlements and missions go until 1769. So when it became Alta California at that point, when Spain moves in, there's at least 300,000 indigenous people living in what would become California at that point. So even though they had, had devastation from disease, there's still a significant number of indigenous people living in what becomes California. So in 1769, the Spanish crown asserts its sovereignty over the region, and they are there until 1821. So this is the period that we'll talk about in a minute of the missions that are established along the coast of California. And there are record sets in there that will include people, indigenous populations, as well as European and settler populations as well. And then in 1821, you have Mexican independence. So while Spain is moving up into Alta California, or what becomes the state of California, there are many American-born Spaniards that were already pushing for independence from Spain. And this occurs in 1821. So then the region becomes a part of Mexico. So when we're talking about the period of Spanish occupation or influence here, there are 21 Spanish missions in California. This is kind of an outline of where they were. And they have them in order. You can see the numbers there of when they were established, which ones came first, and then how they kind of spread out over time. And there are record sets for these missions that can be helpful if you're looking for ancestors from this time period. And the mission records, the Huntington Library has an early California population project, which is an online database containing records created by California's missions between 1769 and 1850. And this is a fantastic database that's been around for about 15 years or so. And they've keep working at making it a bit easier to navigate and to locate records. But it is a database, so it's not original records. You're not going to find scans of the original records on this, but you are going to find the information that they've uploaded into the database from those original records into this collection. So this is an example of what you would see if you did a search on the early California population project. And you can see there are different tabs. There's the main information at the top. You can see the marriage date, the names of the people involved. And you can also see that there's different tabs for the groom's data, the groom's parents, the bride's data, the bride's parents. There's witness information, and then any other miscellaneous information that's included in the record. So they do include a great deal of detail in the database itself. But this is what you're going to see. So this is not you're not seeing an original record here. It's the information that they've then pulled from that record. If you find something on this database that you then are interested in seeing something on this database means that there's an original record somewhere. And if you're interested in seeing that, there are a lot of these records are still maintained by the mission themselves, or local historical societies and things like that. So, and I am going to talk a bit about Family Search has a number of these records that have been microfilmed and scanned and are available digitally as well. So this could be a great jumping off point to maybe finding the original record. But it's a great project. And I should say, this project too, it doesn't just include these missions records, didn't just include indigenous populations, but these are also for the settler populations as well. So, and any kind of anybody local to the area that was a part of the mission. So you will find a range of records for different populations that are all inhabiting the area around the mission. There were also civilian settlements that were set up that are separate from the missions. So when Spain came in, their main objective was to set up these mission settlements that were all centered around the church missions. But there was a push to get civilians that were not attached to mission or a military post established as well. So San Jose is one, established in 1777, which is the first town that's not associated with a mission or a military post. Los Angeles is another, and that was settled in 1781. And what's interesting about the settlement of Los Angeles is that there are 44 people who were included in that settlement, and only 2 were considered white or Spanish. 9 of them were indigenous people, and 1 was both Spanish and indigenous, and then 8 were Spanish and African, and 2 were a full African ancestry. So the settling of Los Angeles was very diverse from the outstart. And many of these original settlers, though, over time came to identify as mestizo, or Spanish and indigenous, or as Spaniards themselves. So you can kind of see how race and identity in Spanish California is fluid, and how things kind of changed over time, but that the area has always been very diverse, with enough people coming from various parts of the world. And this is that record set that I was talking about that's available through FamilySearch.com. This is the California Colonial Records. And if you can see there's the church or mission name. And they do have a number of the records here from different missions that you can then click on and see original images of, or the typed up records that they took from original records. But this is another record set that might give you not really different information from the database, but if you wanted to double check the information in the database, you could go to one of these records to see if there's more information you can glean from looking at the original records. And this is an example. This is a typed up version, but you can see that this even gets you into kind of a later period. So these are records from the 1827. And these were all included on that Family Search list. This is for Los Angeles County, and their baptism records. But this is during the period that the area was controlled by Mexico. So these records actually give a great amount of detail. You can see that they're giving names on this number 67, that on May 23rd, 1827, Maria, she's 1 day old, and that she's a Native American converted to the Catholic religion. So there's a great deal of information about witnesses, who her parents are, and who the sponsors are, all of those types of things. So this can give you a great deal of information of who these families are connected to and related to. So this is all included in that list of California colonial records through family search. So this is shows you the region of the United States at the beginning of the Mexican War in 1846. So by the time New Spain was expanding into Alta California, I had mentioned before, many of the American-born Spaniards believe Mexico should be independent from Spain, and this leads to the War of Independence that ranges from 1810 to 1821. And when Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, the region of California was a part of Mexico for about 2 decades before it was became a part of the United States in 1848, following the Mexican-American War. So this gives you an idea of the region of the Republic of Mexico into what is present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and how it inhabited all of those states. So California comes under the control of the United States following the Mexican-American War in 1848. And what's interesting is this coincides almost exactly with the discovery of gold in the region, which accelerates the movement into the state, or what would become the state, and it accelerates the region's ability to apply for statehood, and it becomes a state in 1850. So that's very shortly after it became an American territory. So the treaty that was signed at the end of the Mexican-American War, in it, the United States agreed to honor land grants that were issued by the Spanish and Mexican governments prior to statehood. And following U.S. statehood, they established the California Land Act of 1851. And this created a 3-member public land commission, which was set up to determine the validity of such land claims. And what it really did was it put the burden of proof on the landholders to present documentation of their claims within a 2-year time frame. Otherwise, their lands would automatically pass into public domain that the United States could then divvy up as it wanted to. So these records, while they have the date of 1851, the records included in these sets, and you can find these sets on Ancestry or Family Search. There's a couple different places that they've been scanned and that you can look at them. But they will include information and proof of land ownership prior to this 1851 date. Because what these records are was Spaniards or Mexican Americans going into, or Mexicans really at that point, going into the US government with their claims to land that they had already received from either Spain or Mexico, and claiming that they owned their property and trying to prove that they own their property to the United States in order to keep and maintain their lands. So there's a great deal of information and detail that goes into the placement of lands, where it's located, and then since the burden of proof is so high to ensure that that the United States wanted to make sure that people could prove that they own this land. So since the burden of proof is high, there's a great deal of detail of how people came into ownership of lands. So this is a pretty important record set if you think you have ancestors that were here at this point, that would have been in the area during Spanish occupation or when the region was when it was Mexico. Because if they owned any land, they would have had to, in order to keep that land, would have had to apply under the Land Act to maintain their land. And this is a part of that same record set. So the California State Archives has a copy of all of these records as well, and you can view them through their site as well. But they're also available on Ancestry, I believe, and I think Family Search has them as well. And they're both in Spanish and they have English translations. The interesting thing about the commission was that they only allowed for the cases to be made in English. So in often cases, there's a translation that happens because many of the people who were applying for these for their land grants to be upheld only spoke Spanish. So the records are included in both languages. There's also these really neat maps that I included here throughout the collection that give an idea of where these lands were. That is just an interesting way to see exactly where the ancestors actually owned land. And this is the same record set through ancestry.com. It's called the Spanish or the California US Spanish Land Records. I believe they have both sets in both Spanish and in English. This is the English translation that I put up here, but you can view them in Spanish on Ancestry as well. And again, they give a good deal of information about the individuals, the land they hold, and sometimes their family as well, because they're trying to prove, kind of generational connection to the land. So I mentioned that right as the Mexican-American War ends and the region of California becomes a U.S. territory, gold is discovered in California as well in January of 1848. And this, the word spreads pretty quickly to the east, but President James K. Polk does not confirm the gold strike to Congress until December of that year, so almost a full year later, in 1848. And this kind of kicks off the boom of, what is now kind of commonly known as the 49ers. So in 1849, about 90,000 people flocked to California. And then it's estimated to grow up to about 300,000 between 1848 and 1855 of people coming to the area in the hopes of striking gold. And you can imagine this has a dramatic effect on the region. So in 1858, it kind of accelerates statehood. So California gains its statehood in 1850. That same year, they also pass the foreign miners tax. And what this was is that non-US citizens would have to pay $20 per month to mine for gold. And this essentially forces Mexicans and Chinese immigrants out of the gold rush, because they really weren't, while they were saying it was a foreign miners tax, they weren't applying this to immigrants from European countries. It was kind of a targeted tax. And this was repealed in 1851, but reestablished in 1852, just targeting the Chinese immigrants. This influx of people from all over the world really has devastating effects on indigenous populations that were already kind of suffering through Spanish occupation and Mexican occupation. But by 1855, the gold rush dies down. Many ended up settling in the region of California. Some go home. There are many that return. But you can see a big population growth in the state between 1850 and the turn of the century. So in 1850, there's near 100,000 people in California, and by 1860, that number has grown to 380,000. So there's an explosion of population of people from the United States and abroad coming to California during that time. And if you're thinking you have ancestors that were involved in the gold rush, this is just a kind of a quick list of where the gold was found. And, you can see it's kind of centered in Northern California. And this can give you an idea of where to look for records if you think that your ancestors may have come out as a part of the gold rush or hoping to strike it rich. And the gold rush itself has effects, more broadly than just people seeking gold and people coming into the state. It kind of kicks off economic growth for the state. And, some of that is due to, and the agriculture in the state in particular, because having that many people come into the area in a short period of time, there's higher demands on the need for food. And that kicks off, kind of the agricultural boom in California. And people, um, you had ranchers from more interior of the United States and also from Mexico who were now herding cattle into the region to help keep up with the demands of the miners for meat. This also pushes the Transcontinental Railroad into the region so that there was easier transportation in and out of the state. And of course, more migrants to California. And I had mentioned earlier that at the turn of the century, the population has really accelerated, and there's about 1.2 million people living in the state at that time. There are collections that do specifically target more the American pioneers, so California pioneers. These are Americans that are moving west and going into California. The California State Library has a collection of index cards with biographical information for pioneers that arrived prior to 1860. And this is kind of an example of what kind of information is included on those cards. They do have information about where they were born, their parents. Sometimes there's little genealogical charts of who they're connected to and how many generations. And these are available on both Ancestry and at familysearch.org. The gold rush also brings African Americans into California. And to mention, as we talked about Los Angeles earlier, people of African descent have been in the region since it became California with Spanish occupation, so much earlier than the gold rush. But the gold rush brought African Americans to California either seeking their own gold, or they were brought to the region by white Southerner enslavers that were bringing them to work for them to seek gold. There are also gold claims by African American miners, one of which I just love the name of. The Sweet Vengeance mine in Browns Valley, California, was discovered by African American miners, and the men went on to use their profits to become entrepreneurs. So this kind of starts the movement of people of African descent from the region of United States into the state is happening with the gold rush. This really takes off with the second Great Migration of African Americans leaving the Deep South to go to other northern areas or to to California to get away from Jim Crow laws in the South. So this brings large populations of African Americans to places like Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Francisco during the second Great Migration of people out of the southern states. And that, I should say, that's between 1940 and like 1940, 1970s when you start seeing that big move. There is a nice project here, the California Migration History Project. This is part of the Great Migrations Project that gives you a better idea of where people were migrating to California from, not just within the United States, but also from places all over the world. And there are a number of different ways that you can look at the information to get a better idea of where people are coming from. So this is one way of looking at it. So, if we just looked at the birthplace of California residents, and in this example, we've selected it, the year is 1850. So this is taking the information from the United States Census in 1850 and is looking at the state population, which is about 92,000 here at that time, and then looking at where the birthplaces are of everyone. And you can see the largest number here in the dark blue is from New York, that they were born in New York. The second is Mexico, Ohio, Massachusetts, California. You can see that people are coming from other parts of the United States in this time. and also from places like Germany, France, England, and other parts of the world. For people that are moving in from the interior United States to west to California, if you're looking for migration routes, there are lists. The Family Search has some good lists about the trails. So you have the California Trail, the Central Overland Trail, the Mormon Trail to South Carolina or South California, Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, Santa Fe Railroad, and Central Pacific Railroad. These are all kind of ways that people are making their migration across the country into California. And sometimes there are record sets included with these migrations, particularly like railroad collections. You can also look at the employment records for people who worked on the railroad. That can give you an idea of people settled out in California. So this is one such example of that. Ancestry.com has railroad employment records, and they are available for free. And it gives you, the person's name, when they were employed, what location that they're in. And then you can use this to find them on census records or see if they stayed in California. And it can give you an idea of their work during their time working for the particular railroad company. In that example, I then went and found the gentleman that was working on the railroad there in the census record here. This is the California state census of 1852. So this is not a federal census. This is the state census that's done shortly after it becomes a United States state. And you can see even here where it has place of birth, and it also includes the last residence. So you can get an idea of where people were born, but also where they're coming from, particularly within the United States. So if you have somebody that was born in Kentucky, their last known residence is Vermont, and now they're living in California. So that can give you an idea if you're trying to work backwards too, of where your ancestors may have come from if you're starting in California working back. There's also an 1850 census for San Joaquin County, and this lists mostly men who went to the southern mines and resided around Stockton, which was then organized into a county. But what I thought was interesting about this is you can obviously see the occupations, but the birthplaces you can see are you've got Germany, Maryland, Virginia, Mexico. So there's people coming from a variety of places to work in the mines. And this is very early after statehood. So it's an early census, but it's very specific to a specific region. So in talking about immigration to California from other places of the world in 1860, you can see that the highest population of immigrants coming from other countries was from China, followed by Ireland, France, England, and then Mexico. So the Chinese start moving in during the gold rush as well, and a bit earlier than that. And their presence in California sets off a number of laws. We talked about the foreign miners tax that was ultimately used to pinpoint or target Chinese Americans. But because these laws exist, there are also record sets that exist. And then you can kind of see the shifting change too. You then have the Chinese Exclusion Act that prevents people from China from coming into the country. So while we had in the previous slide, China was the highest point of immigration. Now you can see that there's more Germany and Ireland have kind of taken over the top spots for that. So it shifted who was coming into the country. So the first wave of Chinese immigration happens with the gold rush in the 1850s, and then the expansion of the railroads in the 1860s. They were working as laborers in both of these industries. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited the immigration from China for about 10 years, and then it was renewed and extended by the Geary Act in 1892. And that was not repealed until 1943. So, in that period of time, anyone that was of Chinese descent living in the United States had a series of, you can see these are ID cards, of laws that were targeted against them. That required a person of any, the Geary Act specifically in 1892 required any person of Chinese descent in the United States to carry proof of residency at all times. And these are record sets that you can access through Family Search. And I think they're on Ancestry too. I have it in the handout. There are Exclusion Act record sets that you can then gather information about ancestors. Ancestry has many of the record sets that are included in the National Archives from the Exclusion Act era. Some of those are included are San Francisco records, the registers of Chinese laborers that are returning to the U.S. between 1882 and 1888. And also Chinese arriving as passengers from 1903 to 1947. And they also have an index to Chinese exclusion case files from 1903 to 1944. And you can see how California, immigration to California shifted in 1920. The birthplace, the highest foreign birthplace in 1920 on the US Census was from Italy and Mexico, which is not surprising given its proximity to California, England, Canada, and you can see Japan is on the rise. So while the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented immigration from China, the Japanese were rising in numbers in California. The rapid growth of Japanese immigrants to California in the early 20th century also created laws that targeted Japanese immigrants. One law in particular restricted land ownership, and there's a record set on ancestry.com called California U.S. Alien Law Ownership Records from 1921 to 1952. And these are also at the California State Archives. What's interesting about these records is these were Japanese born residents that owned land that were then trying to get around this law that were targeting, restricting them from owning land by giving the land over to their American born children through a guardianship to ensure that the land was maintained by the family. So this gives a lot of genealogical information in these records as well. There's also several records for internment camps that occurred during World War II. There are several of these collections on Ancestry. So during World War II, Japanese Americans were west of a particular line that was drawn down the country, were put into internment camps. And if you want to know more about this history, I do have a bit more information in the syllabus. But it's estimated about 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals were resided on the West Coast and that they were forcibly moved into internment camps. So this thing is entire families, even children, who were moved together strictly based on the fact that they were of Japanese descent. And there are several record sets that survive, as well as a newspaper from Manzanar Free Press that you can access on ancestry.com. I think they also have some on Family Search as well. But this is kind of an example down here of a roster for what they called a relocation center. And this is a record for Kyoko Linda. And you can, I don't know if you can see here, but she's number 424 down here at the bottom, 3,424. And you'll see her on the next slide as well. And this is just her obituary from later on in her life. She was a seamstress, and that was something that if you are looking at her record from her time within the internment camp, was something that she did as employment while she was there as well. And she, after the war and after release from the internment camp, um, started her own small studio where she designed clothes. Um, and for many, many socialites. So this is her obituary as well. But there are a number of records for this time period that can give you a great deal of information about the people that were in these internment camps. So statehood also obviously has an effect on the indigenous populations that were already in California prior to any Europeans coming to the area. So with the United States, the American Indian census rolls were then taken in California, and by an act of Congress in 1884, the Bureau of Indian Affairs began an annual census of populations on reservations. And then there are also census rolls for indigenous people who are living off reservations. So there are a number of different census records. This is an example from Round Valley, California. And you can see it gives kind of information about date of birth, where they're living, what their names is. There is a column there also for Indian name, if that's information that they have provided as well. And so if you're interested in indigenous populations living there during American statehood, these are records that may be helpful. This is also the special census of Indians in 1880. And this collection, which is available on ancestry.com, includes the Round Valley Reservation. And this has special detailed questions about education, land, property, and the ability to support oneself. So these are for individuals who were indigenous, but were living off of reservations. And it gives you a little bit more information about the family and their livelihood. As far as vital records go, just as a whole, things that you might want to just keep in mind. I didn't want to go into details of like where you would find vital records because, Family Search kind of has their wiki page of California and you can find them there. But just general information, the state level vital records began in 1905, so they weren't required by the state until that date. So you may or may not found them at the county level prior to that. Some things to keep in mind about marriage records. California has both public and confidential marriage records. This is kind of unique to California. So confidential marriage records, they have existed since the 1870s. And what that means is that only the parties on the record have access to the record. So if you're having a hard time finding a marriage record in California, it could be that your ancestor had a confidential marriage record. These were not that popular because most people didn't know that they could get them, but it's just something to keep in mind that it's a possibility. California also had what was called a gin marriage law, which required a 3-day waiting period between filing for a license and performing the ceremony. So this starts about 1927 and ends about 1940. But it did encourage people to go to neighboring states if they wanted to have a quick wedding, to get married quicker. So you might want to look in states like Arizona or Nevada if you are having a hard time finding a marriage. There's also great newspaper collections throughout California. There's the California Digital Newspaper Collection. Online Archives of California has the Manzanar Free Press. That's for the Manzanar internment camp. Calisphere, which I'll put a slide up in a minute, has a number of links to collections that have newspapers from across the state that you can access. You could also go to the Library of Congress Chronicling America for their California newspapers just to see what might be available in the region that you're looking for. And newspapers.com and Genealogy Bank have a number of newspapers from across the state as well. So Calisphere is really, it's a neat site. I recommend going if you're looking for anybody in the state of California. And this is powered by the University of California. And they have a variety of different collections, photograph collections, student newspapers, architectural drawings, building permits, manuscripts, scrapbooks, gold rush collections. I mean, these are just a few things that I could list briefly on this page of the types of collections that they have. Some of these are available digitally that you can just download or look at while you're on the page. Some of them give you more information about what repository you might visit or contact about getting more information about that record set. But this gives you a good idea of what exists across the state. So in conclusion, this is just the beginning. There are so many more stories and record sets to uncover in California. And I couldn't talk about every single group that had, made their migration into California. But I did want to kind of highlight groups that had record sets created because of their presence in California, and give you kind of an overview of the history of the state, because understanding the history of a place can give you a better idea of where to find records. So I hope that this was somewhat helpful, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, for that great presentation this afternoon. So we will get to all of your questions that you've been submitting, and you can keep those coming if you have more questions. Before we get into that, I just quickly wanted to highlight some upcoming events that may be of interest to you. So first here, we currently have an ongoing online course, Researching Immigrant Ancestors to America, 1620 to 1965. This is happening on Wednesdays in July. We've had the first two classes, but you would get access to the recordings of those if you sign up now. And then we have an author event on July 15th, Robert Sullivan with Double Exposure, Resurveying the West with Timothy O'Sullivan, America's Most Mysterious Photographer. And then on July 18th, we have a lecture from our senior genealogist, Melanie McComb, on understanding and utilizing indexes. All right, so we can go ahead and turn to your questions here. So let's see, Megan. So first, we had a question asking um, about an ancestor who came to California as a prospector, and he kind of lived and mined in the area in the 1840s till about 1875, and then returned east. And this person's wondering, how might she begin to figure out where in California he lived? Do you have any recommendations for how to kind of approach that?
Well, I think, maybe starting with looking at some of those general migration maps, if you kind of know where he was coming from beforehand, to where he ended up in California, you can kind of see where what routes people were taking. I would also check out some of those that 1852 census for the state, and see if you can find, even if you're having a hard time maybe finding the name, if you know where he was born, or kind of roundabout date, try different searching options to see if you can find anybody that's matching any of the information that you know about him. um, Grabbing him in, I think we all tend to look at the federal census, but if he's there at the 1852 mark, that might be helpful. The state census. And then if he's there because of the gold rush, I mean, there's communities, and, even the specific community. I mean, that's why I listed out where gold was found, because people were going to those regions specifically. So combining that with migration routes, and then maybe kind of piecing together what you can find on a census record may give you a better indication of where he ended up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Megan. Um, let's see here. There was also a question. Someone is looking for San Francisco court records about 1866. They have a family member who was convicted of a felony and sent to San Quentin. How would you recommend kind of investigating that?
I mean, if you haven't tried contacting the county specifically, or the county courts yet, that would be my first suggestion, would be to contact the court directly and see if they have any information. So most county courts have, even where you could write in a question or a phone number that you can call to give you more information about where those records may be held or how you could access them.
Great. Thank you very much. And then we had a question. I made a note. I think it came in when we were on slide 17. So I'm just going to pull that back up so we can all refer to it. I believe it was referring to this page. The question says, the chart says LA settlement had 42 people, but it lists the origin/mix of just 22. Do you know what the other 20 were?
Oh, I think that's in response to the Los Angeles makeup of the original racial
Let's see, I
makeup of
missed.
Los Angeles.
Is it
Um,
this? Oh, no. Sorry, pulling up the wrong slides
no,
here.
no, no, that's okay. Um, let me just see if I made a typo, because I could have just made a typo. Um, all right, let me see. Hold on 1 second. Um,
Nope.
okay. I could have just made it. I think could just be a typo.
Okay,
So
we
it's
can.
44 people. Yeah. I think it's supposed to be 22.
Okay, got it. Perfect. Let me get the
I'll
questions.
double check on that and I can get back to you. I'll make sure that I have my typo corrected for the handout.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And we can update that. And to the person who asked that, I can also send you an email as well. All right, perfect. Then let's see here. We'll do a few more questions. Um, let's see. A question about how to find land records and wills. They're looking at the time period of kind of 1850 to 1900.
Okay. So I'm wondering if they've been to, I'm wondering what specific, I didn't go into specific um records. What's area in California are they looking for? Does it say?
It does not say.
Okay. So if you go on to, like, where I always start when you're kind of just looking for the baseline of wills and or probate records and land records, is a nice place to start is familysearch.org. And you can go, they have like a wiki section there. And you can type in California and see what kind of records pop up. You can also, another option is to go on Family Search, go to their catalog and type in California and the county that you're interested in looking for, and then going down to their land and property records and seeing what they have scanned. If you're not finding what you're looking for there, I do see that there are land records. I'm kind of looking at Family Search right now. There are land records for California on Family Search that are digitized that you could access. If you're not finding things there, or they don't have something for the county that you're looking for, you could contact the county clerk directly and see if they have records. Sometimes the records just have not been digitized or don't exist online. So contacting the county directly will give you a better sense of if they have wills, land records, those types of things, or if you need to go elsewhere, if they've been moved offsite to a different repository.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Then we've also received a few questions asking if any records were lost in the San Francisco fire of 1906. Do you have an answer for that?
But that I don't, I would assume that there have been, but I did not find anything while I was putting this together that specifically stated that a record set had been lost in that fire. But I would imagine that there were issues with that. I'm curious if I actually pull up San Francisco now. You've got me curious. Um There might be information on that in the California wiki on Family Search. Francisco. That might give you a better idea of, usually they'll have things that will say, you know, this record set was lost, or there's a gap in a record based on fire. Record loss. Okay, so according to this, so in 1906, courthouse and all records were destroyed during the earthquake and fire of 1906. So yes, there were record sets lost. That would be specific at the county level and at the courthouses.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then we got a couple of questions in about the confidential marriages that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So someone was wondering, do you know if a confidential marriage was more expensive than a regular marriage certificate? And then what was the reason these came into existence? And someone else was wondering, when did these confidential marriage records end? Sorry, I jammed a few questions in there, so I can repeat any if you need.
No, that's okay. So I'm not 100% sure on the reasoning why it came into existence, but I'm pretty sure it didn't cost anything different than a regular. Um, I think they may still exist. um, Let me just double check on that. Yeah, so apparently you still could in California have a confidential marriage record. And you know, they just say the reasoning that is protect sensitive information. And so it still is a law that exists in California. And it can be used by any person over 18 years or older. Um, and it doesn't cost any difference. It just makes it so your marriage record is not open to the public.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, let's see here. We'll try to squeeze in maybe one more question here. Um, so we did get a question. Do you know kind of the common migration routes that might have been taken from, say, New York to San Francisco in the mid 1850s, or kind of general migration routes from the Northeast?
Yeah, so that migrations page that I mentioned does have, it kind of outlines the different trails that people were taking. So you do have, you know, kind of your wagon trails that existed to get across the country that would be primary paths of migration across the country into California. And then once the railroads are connected and you kind of have this transcontinental railroad, that becomes kind of the main path of transportation across the country into the state. So those are pretty clear lines of migration. Even when you're looking at the wagon trails, they're pretty defined routes. And they're the page that I mentioned earlier, that specifically talks about migrations more greatly. It's a migration project. It's not just about California, would give you a better sense of the specific trails. FamilySearch.org also has a very nice page about California trails that gives you links to each one of the trails. I only mentioned a few in that slide that kind of gave the map of going across the country. But if you go on to Family Search in the wiki and you look up, you know, California trails, you'll get a listing of the different routes that went across the country. And then they have links within that of if there's any records that's connected to that. But it could at least give you a little bit more detailed information about where and exactly how they went across the US.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Megan, again for the great presentation today and for answering those great questions we had coming in. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. You had a lot of wonderful ones out there. So if you do have more specific questions about your family history research, you might consider hiring our research services team or using our expanded chat service. I highly recommend using our Ask a Genealogist chat service. It puts you in direct communication with a genealogist, and it's totally free and open to the public Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time. To access this service, you can just go to americanancestors.org/chat, and you can get a lot of the questions that we didn't get to this afternoon answered there as well. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with our experts at the link shown on the screen or through the QR code displayed there as well. And thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on this program. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and others. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.